For 5 decades, a specific image defined Venice. A photograph taken on a midsummer morning in St. Mark's Square. Shoulder to shoulder, a sea of people so dense you cannot see the ancient paving stones beneath them. It was a crisis, they said. A city drowning in success, suffocating under 30 million visitors a year. Now visit that same square at dawn in recent seasons. The pigeons, not the people, claim the center. In Cannaregio, quiet returns after 9 p.m. Boutique hotels that boasted 2-year waitlists are sending marketing emails offering same-day discounts. For the first time in modern memory, gondoliers are observed waiting patiently for custom, rather than aggressively managing reservations weeks in advance. The official narrative is that this is the dawn of sustainable equilibrium. The masses are gone, the city can breathe, but that is not what is actually happening. The tourists not leave to give Venice space. They left because Venice gave them too many reasons to go, and what is replacing them, or rather, what is failing to replace them, uncovers a demographic and commercial reversal that official tourism data does not capture. This is not a story about temporary vacancy or fluctuating demand. This is the structural dissolution of a city that spent 50 years aggressively monetizing its own mythology. Until the mythology itself cracked under the strain of being the only thing left, Venice has been described as a city dying. This is not a sudden realization. Venice has been dying for longer than most modern states have existed. The problem is that it has always managed to make its decline look like elegance. You cannot see the structural failure beneath the gold leaf. You cannot hear the rot when mandolins play across the water. The significant shift happening right now is that the elegance is no longer sufficient cover for the numbers. By 1951, the resident population of Venice's historic center was 174,000. It was a dense, functioning city. In recent estimates, that figure has fallen below 50,000. When you strip away second homes, ghost addresses, and residents registered elsewhere for tax purposes, many locals place the true active population even lower. The city loses an average of 1,000 residents every year, not to death, but to departure. Venetians are choosing to leave their own city because it has become functionally uninhabitable for ordinary human life. They depart as rents benchmarked against tourist incomes rise, and essential services disappear, replaced by a visual simulation of a city. The remaining infrastructure is calibrated for 3 times the current population, yet the essential services that a 50,000-person town requires, supermarkets, pharmacies, local schools, are consistently being optimized for the 100,000 day trippers. This creates the reality of an infrastructure of a city without the city. This demographic reality is what is driving the commercial reversal. A city without residents is a stage set. Increasingly, the visitors arriving are realizing that they are walking through a performance rather than a place. The authentic interaction they came to find, the waiter who is a neighbor, the shopkeeper who is a craftsman, has been exported, often along with the very soul of the object they seek to purchase. There was a specific kind of traveler who made Venice commercially successful, not the 4-hour fair cruise passenger, but the one who stayed for a week, ate where the owner recommended, got lost in Castello, and found a church not listed in any guidebook, sitting there in silence. That traveler is now leaving. This departure is not motivated by cost alone, though cost is a factor. It is motivated by the erosion of the experience. Venice is no longer capable of delivering the depth it once promised. Remove the living city, and you have architecture. Beautiful architecture, yes, but not architecture that alone justifies 4 hours on a budget airline and €200 a night for a room. The cruise ship economy accelerated this demographic erosion faster than almost any single factor in Venetian history, including the Black Death and Napoleon. At its peak, this model optimized Venice for throughput, maximizing bodies and minimizing time. The 2021 ban on large ships from the Giudecca Canal was hailed as a heritage victory. What the official announcement ignored was the 35% economic hole that the absence of those passengers creates, and who, or what, would fill it. The answer is not enough. The high-value, long-stay travelers whom Venice now desperately courts require something the city systematically destroyed for 30 years. A living city, not a museum that closes its doors. They require a place where things happen after 9 p.m. and where life is made, not just displayed. For decades, Venice optimized itself for throughput. That optimization is extraordinarily effective for one kind of tourism, but it is lethal for every other kind. The decline is not random fluctuation. It is a predictable market correction for a destination that sold the idea of itself so effectively that the idea was eventually all that remained. But the data only tells part of the story. The true depth of this structural reversal is visible only when you look at the physical spaces where Venetian commerce and daily life used to intersect. To understand how a monopoly on beauty disintegrates from within, one must examine the microeconomies of specific sestieri, the 6 historic districts that make up the city. In the mid-20th century, districts like Cannaregio and Castello functioned as self-contained economic ecosystems. They possessed their own bakeries, metalworking shops, and distinct neighborhood identities. Today, a walk through the northern reaches of Cannaregio reveals a landscape defined by negative space. Where there were once 3 competing family-owned pastificios on a single calle, there is now a single brightly lit grocery outlet catering almost exclusively to short-term renters seeking prepackaged pasta. The storefronts between them do not stand empty in the traditional sense. They have been converted into automated luggage storage depots. These windowless, neon-lit rooms filled with metal lockers have quietly replaced the traditional dry cleaners and cobblers. They represent the ultimate optimization of space for a transient population. High yield, zero human labor, and zero contribution to the civic fabric. This spatial conversion is driven by a stark financial divergence. In the Rialto market area, the historic fish market, the Pescaria, has seen its vendor count drop by over 70% in less than 2 decades. The reason is not a lack of interest in seafood, but a structural shift in consumption. A transient population staying in an apartment for 48 hours does not buy whole sea bass to clean and cook. They buy small, portable snacks or dine out at establishments that rely on frozen, centralized supply chains. On certain mornings, the marble stalls of the Pescaria sit entirely bare, a striking absence of color and noise in a space that had been continuously occupied by commerce since the year 1097. The traditional fishmongers who retired have found no one willing to purchase their licenses. The economic value has migrated entirely away from production and toward possession. The buildings themselves are worth millions as real estate assets, but the activities that gave those buildings their names are no longer solvent. This creates a highly specific market distortion within the local real estate sector. In a normal city, when demand falls, prices adjust to attract new residents. In Venice, this self-correcting mechanism is broken. The housing stock is divided into 2 entirely separate economic realities. There is the residential market, which is bound by local wages that average roughly 25,000 euros a year, and there is the international investment market, where apartments are valued based on their potential yield as short-term holiday rentals. Because a single apartment rented to tourists for 12 days a month can generate double the revenue of a long-term local lease, the residential market has been effectively starved of inventory. Even with tourist numbers softening in the historic center, property values remain artificially inflated. The owners of these properties prefer to leave them vacant during shoulder seasons, holding out for peak weekend rates, rather than lowering the rent to a level that a local nurse, teacher, or boatwright could afford. The result is a cityscape of dark windows. Walk through San Marco or Dorsoduro after 10 p.m. in November, and you will find entire blocks where not a single light is visible. The buildings are occupied on spreadsheets in London, Paris, or Milan, but they are dark on the ground. This hollowed-out structure has fundamentally altered the nature of the labor market within the lagoon. Venice was once a city of specialized high-skill manual labor. The glassblowers of Murano, the lace-makers of Burano, and the shipwrights of the Arsenale formed a highly organized guild system that preserved technical knowledge across generations. Today, the local economy has been flattened into a single, low-skill service industry centered on hospitality logistics. The remaining jobs are predominantly casualized, low-wage positions: chambermaids, baggage handlers, boat pilots, and waiters. Why is this divide so exceptionally large? It is because the city has systematically disincentivized any enterprise that does not directly feed the immediate consumption cycle of the visitor. A tech startup or a design firm cannot compete for office space with a luxury boutique or a souvenir franchise. Consequently, the young, educated demographic has no choice but to emigrate to the mainland or to the industrial centers of the Veneto region, like Padua and Treviso. They leave behind an aging population that is increasingly dependent on a volatile, seasonal industry that no longer offers long-term security. The impact on the traditional craft industries provides the clearest evidence of this internal collapse. Consider the Murano glass industry, an enterprise that once generated immense wealth for the Republic and sustained thousands of families. Today, over half of the glass items sold in the shops lining the tourist paths near the Rialto Bridge are imported counterfeits, manufactured in factories across East Asia, and stamped with misleading labels. The local furnaces cannot compete with the production costs of these mass-produced replicas, especially given the skyrocketing costs of methane gas required to keep the Venetian kilns burning continuously. As authentic furnaces close down, the specialized knowledge required to create complex filigree or marine glass dies with the master craftsman. The souvenir shops remain full of glass trinkets, but the industry itself has been transformed from a productive manufacturing sector into a retail distribution network for foreign goods. The visitor purchases a piece of Venice, unaware that the object was never touched by a Venetian hand, nor does its sale support a Venetian wage. The tourism apparatus has responded to these visible cracks not by addressing the structural causes, but by introducing increasingly bureaucratic mechanisms of control. The implementation of the entry fee system for day trippers, the access contribution, is the most prominent example of this approach. Framed by city officials as a groundbreaking measure to regulate crowds and protect the urban environment, the €5 fee acts primarily as a psychological barrier that solidifies the city's transition from an open urban space into a closed attraction. It treats the symptoms of overcrowding, while ignoring the underlying real estate and labor distortions that made the city vulnerable in the first place. The revenue generated by the tax is largely absorbed by the administrative costs of running the checkpoint system itself, the turnstiles, the digital tracking infrastructure, and the enforcement personnel who stand at the entrances to the city. It is a system designed to manage a museum, not to sustain a living society. The systemic failure becomes undeniable when one looks at the city's institutional infrastructure. The Ospedale Civile, the historic hospital located next to the Basilica of San Giovanni e Paolo, features grand Renaissance facades and vast, vaulted corridors built for an era when the city teemed with life. Today, its specialized wards are facing steady consolidation. Medical equipment and specialized staff are increasingly concentrated on the mainland in Mestre, where the actual population resides. A local resident requiring complex care faces the logistical challenge of water ambulance transport across the lagoon, a journey that highlights the growing disconnect between the historic center's physical reality and the modern world's administrative efficiency. The infrastructure remains magnificent, but it functions as a shell, scaled for a population that has vanished and maintained primarily to ensure that visitors have access to basic medical services should an emergency arise during their stay. This process of extraction and hollowing out has reached a point where the CI's physical survival is now decoupled from its social survival. The multi-billion-euro MOS mobile barrier system, designed to protect the city from the devastating Acqua Alta high tides, successfully raises its gates during severe weather events to keep the sea out. The engineering feat is impressive, and it ensures that the churches, museums, and hotels remain dry. Yet, while the stone is protected from the water, there are fewer and fewer people inside those buildings to inherit the history they represent. The barriers keep the lagoon at bay, but they cannot stop the quiet daily exodus of the population through the Santa Lucia train station or across the Liberty Bridge. The city has managed to solve the problem of physical inundation, only to find that the social fabric has washed away from the inside. Yet the most surprising layer of this transformation is still hidden within the financial networks that fund the city's ongoing preservation. Behind these statistics are real lives being reshaped, lived out in the narrow gaps left between the real estate markets and the tourist corridors. To look closely at the remaining population of Venice is to observe a community engaged in a quiet, exhausting conflict against the very geography of their hometown. Consider the daily routine of a family living in the Castello district, one of the last neighborhoods where Italian is still widely heard on the street. For these residents, a simple task like purchasing groceries has been transformed into a logistical challenge. The local bakery closed 3 years ago when the landlord declined to renew the lease, opting instead to convert the ground floor into a high-yield artisanal chocolate boutique aimed at weekend travelers. To buy fresh vegetables, a resident must now walk past multiple mask shops and glass vendors, to reach one of the few remaining produce barges moored along the canals. Every heavy bag of provisions must be carried over multiple stone bridges, steps designed centuries ago for foot traffic, now crowded with tourists, dragging wheeled suitcases that bounce loudly against the Istrian stone. This physical friction is accompanied by a deeper psychological displacement. The social spaces that once anchored Venetian civic life have been systematically dismantled. The campi, the public squares that serve as the traditional living rooms of each neighborhood, were historically spaces where children played football after school, where neighbors conversed across open windows, and where the elderly sat on stone benches to watch the day pass. Today, these squares are increasingly occupied by the outdoor seating of restaurants specializing in tourist menus. The open public space has been commercialized, cordoned off by iron railings and white umbrellas. The children are absent, not merely because school enrollments are shrinking, but because there is no longer open ground where a ball can be kicked without hitting a cafe table or a visitor's camera. The elderly residents find that the public benches have been removed or repositioned to discourage loitering, a deliberate design choice intended to keep the flow of pedestrian traffic moving smoothly through the historic center. The displacement extends into the domestic sphere, where the precarity of housing creates a constant sense of impermanence. Many of the remaining renters live under the constant threat of the finita locazione, the expiration of their lease. Landlords frequently decline to renew long-term residential contracts, knowing they can double their income by listing the property on digital travel platforms. This reality forces local families into a nomadic existence within their own city, moving from one short-term winter lease to another, always aware that when the spring season arrives they will likely be priced out of the historic center entirely. Those who refuse to leave migrate to the mainland suburbs of Mestre or Marghera, industrial towns built on flat land, completely detached from the lagoon's aesthetic grandeur. They commute back into Venice by train or bus every morning, crossing the Liberty Bridge not as citizens returning home, but as service workers entering an international resort. They clean the rooms, pilot the water taxis, and cook the meals for a city they can no longer afford to inhabit. The impact on the younger generation is a definitive indicator of the city's trajectory. For the few young people who grow up in Venice, the city offers an inheritance that is both magnificent and suffocating. A student graduating from the Ca' Foscari University finds an economy that has almost no use for their degree unless it can be applied to the management of hospitality assets. There are no corporate headquarters, no independent research institutes, and no creative agencies that can survive the overhead costs of the historic center. A young Venetian who wishes to pursue a career in technology, law, or contemporary industrial design must leave. This departure is marked by a specific form of melancholy. They are not leaving a declining industrial town in search of economic opportunity. They are leaving one of the most beautiful urban environments on Earth, because that beauty has become a commodity that excludes them. When they leave, they take with them the living culture of the city, the specific Venetian dialect, the knowledge of the tides, the traditional rowing techniques, and the shared memory of neighborhood histories. What remains behind is an aging population, a community that is literally running out of time. This human absence has fundamentally changed the sensory experience of the city itself. The sounds of Venice were once defined by human industry, the rhythmic hammering of caulkers in the boatyards, the calls of street vendors selling lagoon seafood, the shouting of children across the canals, and the deep bells of neighborhood churches calling residents to local assemblies. Today, the acoustic landscape has been flattened. In the evenings, after the day trippers have departed and the day-use water taxis have fallen silent, the sound that dominates the canals is the hollow clicking of plastic wheels against stone bridges, the constant, mechanical white noise of luggage being dragged toward apartments. In the mornings, the church bells still ring, but they frequently call out to empty pews. The congregations have dwindled to a handful of elderly parishioners, and many historic churches are kept open only by charging admission fees to visitors who come to admire the altarpieces as detached works of art. Severed from the living community that once gave those spaces their devotional meaning, this is the final turn of the pattern that Venice has spent decades perfecting. The city has succeeded in transforming its entire physical structure into an optimization machine for tourism, only to discover that the process is irreversible. You cannot easily convert a short-term rental back into a family home once the local bakeries, schools, and pharmacies have vanished. You cannot re-establish a community of craftsmen once the lineage of technical knowledge has been broken by emigration. The city has arrived at a state of advanced financialization, where the stone is worth more than the society inside it. The official initiatives to save Venice, the entry fees, the ship bans, the heritage designations, are ultimately exercises in preservation rather than restoration. They are designed to maintain the physical artifact, to ensure that the palaces do not collapse into the water, and that the paintings remain protected from the humidity. They do not, and cannot, preserve the human life that created the artifact in the first place. What Venice offers the modern world is a sobering view of the logical conclusion of unchecked cultural and economic extraction. It is the advanced case study of what happens when an urban center stops functioning as an engine of the present and relies entirely on the consumption of its past. The global economy is full of destinations that are moving along this same path, trading their living complexity for the predictable revenues of a managed theme park. Venice is simply further down the road, sitting in the fading light of the Adriatic, magnificent and hollow. The tragedy of the city is not that it will disappear beneath the rising waves of the lagoon, but that it will survive perfectly intact as an architectural monument, a beautifully preserved container from which the contents have been permanently removed. The final image of Venice is not one of dramatic ruin, but of an empty theater, its stage lit by the morning sun, its gold leaf gleaming in the silence, waiting for an audience that buys a ticket to see a city that no longer exists.